Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The haunted college night, a freshman's worst nightmare. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The air was crisp with the arrival of fall, and the excitement of a new semester was thick in the atmosphere. Freshmen walked around campus with wide eyes, taking in the massive buildings and sprawling quads, unsure of what awaited them. But for many students, the first week at college was all about one thing: the party. That Friday night, the dormitories buzzed with anticipation. The party was being thrown by the upperclassmen, and it promised to be the event of the semester. The theme was simple: Welcome to the Hell, a fitting choice considering the legends that surrounded the old dormitory building. Some of the older students claimed the building had a history, but no one took it seriously. At least, not until the night of the party. The beginning of the night. Cassie had just arrived on campus, nervous and excited, carrying her bags into her dorm room. She was a freshman, shy and trying to figure out where she belonged. Her roommate, Sarah, was a bubbly sophomore who had already been to a few parties. "You've got to come tonight," Sarah insisted, adjusting her outfit in front of the mirror. "It's gonna be epic. I promise." Cassie hesitated. She wasn't sure about going, but after hearing Sarah's endless excitement, she gave in. They were both dressed in casual clothes, ready to blend in with the crowd, or so they thought. But as they made their way to the party, the atmosphere on campus felt different. The usual chatter was hushed, and the air felt unnaturally still. As they entered the old building where the party was being held, a chill ran down Cassie's spine. The ancient hallways creaked with each step they took, and the flickering lights added an eerie touch. Still, she dismissed it as nothing more than her imagination. After all, it was a college party, and she was eager to meet new people. The living room was packed. Music pumped through the speakers, and laughter echoed off the walls. Students were everywhere, some in groups chatting, others dancing or playing beer pong. But there was something about the place that felt off. The decorations were too dark, and a few of the faces Cassie saw didn't seem to belong. They were older, almost ghostly pale, and there was an odd, unsettling gleam in their eyes. "Come on, let's get some drinks." Sarah pulled her through the crowd, excited to immerse themselves in the chaos of the night. They made their way toward the kitchen, where a makeshift bar had been set up. People were chattering away, but Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just the nerves of being in a new environment. But as the night progressed, things started to take a strange turn. The arrival of the ghost. At some point during the night, Cassie lost track of time. She had made some new friends and had a few drinks, but the eerie feeling never quite left. Around midnight, the music cut off suddenly, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Everyone turned toward the door, where a tall figure stood. His face was covered by a dark hood, and he was dressed in an old, tattered cloak. His presence alone seemed to absorb the light in the room. No one knew who he was, but it was clear he wasn't a student. His presence was unsettling, like something not quite right. But despite the discomfort, people began to talk to him, drawn in by an unknown force. Cassie, however, felt a cold shiver go down her spine. "Who is that guy?" she asked Sarah, but her roommate simply shrugged, her face pale. "I don't know, but I don't like it." The man stood in the corner, watching everyone, his eyes glinting under the hood. Cassie felt drawn to him, as if some invisible thread was pulling her toward him. But just as she was about to make her way over, the lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped. Then, a voice, deep, gravelly, and cold, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come." The crowd froze, confused. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the party. But others grew tense, their faces suddenly filled with fear. The figure in the corner stepped forward, and in a flash, his hood was thrown back. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through the crowd. His skin was pale, as though he hadn't seen sunlight in decades. He wasn't just a man, he was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. Cassie's heart raced. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on her. And then, in a whisper that chilled her to the bone, the figure spoke again. "This place is mine. You are not welcome here." The lights flickered again, this time more violently, and the room was plunged into darkness. Panic erupted. People screamed, stumbled over one another in a rush to escape, but no one could see anything. The air grew thick with fear, and the temperature dropped even further. A struggle for survival. Cassie's breathing quickened. She grabbed Sarah's arm, but her friend seemed frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. It was as if the figure had cast some sort of spell on them, trapping them in his gaze. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Cassie knew they needed to leave, but the door was nowhere in sight. She could hear people yelling in the distance, but it felt as though the walls had shifted, blocking every exit. Then, through the darkness, Cassie heard a whisper, the same cold voice as before. "You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." The shadows seemed to close in on her, and for a moment, she felt as though she were suffocating. The air was thick with a heavy, oppressive force. She reached for Sarah, but her roommate was gone, lost in the chaos. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But the party was no longer the same. The students who had been dancing moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes wide open in horror. They were like puppets, their bodies still, but their eyes filled with an unspoken fear. And the figure, now standing in the center of the room, grinned. "You should have stayed away," he said, his voice low and mocking. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest. She could barely breathe, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut before her. There was no escape. Not now. Not ever. Cassie's pulse raced, her heart thundering in her chest as she pressed herself against the cold wall. The dim lights flickered above her, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living creatures. The figure, his haunting grin still plastered on his skeletal face, moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing in the room like the toll of a death knell. She had to get out. But no matter how hard she tried, her legs wouldn't move. It was as if an invisible force had pinned her in place, binding her to the ground. Panic clawed at her throat, and her breaths became shallow, ragged. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, swallowed by the heavy, oppressive silence that had descended over the room. The students around her, those who hadn't managed to flee, stood motionless, their eyes wide and unblinking, their bodies stiff and frozen. It was as though they were in a trance, completely at the mercy of the shadowy figure who now stood at the center of the room, surveying them like prey. Cassie's thoughts spun in a frantic whirl. Was this a prank? Was this some kind of elaborate hoax set up by the upperclassmen? But something in the pit of her stomach told her that this wasn't just a prank. The chilling air, the cold, lifeless stares of her classmates, and the unmistakable sense of dread that seemed to grip her heart, it was all too real. "You should have stayed away," the figure crooned, his voice a low, mocking whisper that sent icy shivers down her spine. He took a slow step toward her, his movements unnaturally fluid, as though he were gliding rather than walking. His hollow eyes bored into hers, and for the first time, Cassie realized something. This wasn't a man at all. It was something far worse. His skin was ashen, almost gray in the dim light, and his features were sharp and angular, like a corpse that had been long forgotten. His lips parted in a grin that was more a rictus of death than a smile, revealing teeth that were too white, too pointed, and far too many. His entire being radiated a coldness that seemed to freeze the very air around him. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, leaning closer to her. "The darkness. It's in the walls. It's in the floor. It's in you." Cassie's chest tightened as his words slithered into her mind. She wanted to run, to scream, but she couldn't move. She was trapped in this nightmare, and there was no escape. Behind the figure, the other students remained still, their eyes vacant and lifeless. But then, slowly, one of them began to move. A girl, barely a year older than Cassie, stepped forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though she was being controlled by some invisible force. Cassie's breath caught in her throat as the girl spoke, her voice hollow and distant. "You won't let us go," she murmured, her eyes empty. "We're his, forever." The words sent a shock of terror through Cassie. She stumbled backward, her body shaking with fear, but still, she couldn't break free from the unseen force that held her in place. The girl's expression twisted into a grotesque smile, her lips curling in a way that was inhuman, as though her face itself was being stretched by an unseen hand. "He's feeding on your fear," the girl continued, her voice growing more and more distant. "You won't stop until you've given him everything. Your soul, your will, everything." Cassie's mind raced. What did that mean? What was happening? And how could she escape? The figure in the corner, the one who had called himself the owner of this place, stepped forward again, his cold, dead eyes never leaving her. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and twisted, like the talons of some monstrous creature. "You're already mine," he whispered, his voice low and resonant. "You just don't know it yet." Just then, the door slammed open. The sudden sound of the door creaking on its hinges broke the suffocating silence, and Cassie's heart leapt in her chest. Without thinking, she turned and bolted for the exit. The room seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the door so far away that it might as well have been a mile. The other students, those who were still moving, watched her with empty eyes, their faces expressionless. She reached the door, her hand shaking as she grabbed the handle. But just as her fingers brushed it, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Cassie was thrown back, the force knocking the breath from her lungs. She hit the ground hard, her body aching. Her mind screamed in desperation as she scrambled to her feet, trying to regain control of her fraying nerves. But the figure was closing in on her, its presence looming like a predator that had cornered its prey. "You can't escape," the figure hissed, his voice now a dark, hollow echo in the room. There's nowhere to run. Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears as she turned to face him, her thoughts clouded with terror. What could she do? How could she stop this? The party, the laughter, the music, it was all gone, replaced by a suffocating presence that threatened to consume her whole. As the figure reached out toward her, Cassie's eyes landed on the old fireplace in the corner of the room. It was a dark, charred pit, but there was something about it, something in the air around it, that caught her attention. Without thinking, she sprinted toward it, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. She didn't know why, but she had to get there. It was the only way. The figure snarled behind her, but Cassie didn't stop. She dove for the fireplace, reaching out for the cold, jagged stone that lined its edges. Her fingers brushed the rough surface, and as she touched it, a wave of cold rushed through her. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness once more. Cassie gasped, the sound of her breathing harsh and desperate in the silence. But then, slowly, she began to feel a shift. The pressure, the suffocating weight of fear, began to ease, just a little. She reached out again, her fingers brushing against something that felt different. It was the warmth of light. And then, before she could even register what was happening, a blinding flash erupted from the fireplace, engulfing the entire room in light. For a moment, everything was silent. Cassie's eyes burned from the brightness, and she shielded her face with her hands, not daring to open them fully. The light was blinding, unnatural, like a force that tore through the very fabric of reality. It seemed to stretch on forever, an eternity of searing white that swallowed everything around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, the beat thundering in her ears, and the weight of fear in her stomach only grew stronger. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the light disappeared. For a long moment, there was only silence. The oppressive darkness returned, but it was different this time, less suffocating, as though something had been shifted, altered in some way. Slowly, Cassie dared to open her eyes, her breath still shallow as she surveyed the room. The atmosphere had changed. The figure, the one who had been haunting the party, was gone. The oppressive sense of dread that had filled the space seemed to have lifted, but it was replaced by a new kind of uncertainty. The other students who had been frozen in place were no longer still. They were gone. Some were standing in corners of the room, others were near the windows, staring blankly at the darkened sky. Their eyes, though still distant, seemed to flicker with some strange recognition. Cassie slowly got to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. She scanned the room, confused and disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was this all some kind of elaborate prank? A twisted game? Or had it been something much worse? But before she could dwell on it too much, a voice pierced the air, a voice she had not heard before. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second. It's not over. Not yet. Cassie spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was a new figure. This one wasn't the skeletal man who had terrorized them before. No, this was something even more disturbing, more unsettling. The person was dressed in what appeared to be a tattered gown, their skin pale and translucent, like a specter that had risen from the depths of a forgotten grave. Their hair was long and wild, hanging in tangled strands around their face. The features of their face were blurred, almost impossible to make out, as though they were constantly shifting, never fully solid. The figure stepped forward, its feet barely making a sound on the floor. Cassie's stomach twisted with dread as the air grew colder once more, her breath fogging in front of her. The voice that followed was not the same one she had heard earlier. This voice was colder, emptier. "Did you think you were free?" the figure asked, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "The darkness is just beginning." Cassie froze, her heart racing again as the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. The figure raised its hand, and the walls of the room seemed to pulsate with a strange, rhythmic energy. The shadows grew long and twisted, crawling across the floor and up the walls like living things. "You shouldn't have touched it," the figure said, stepping closer still. "You've opened the door, and now there's no turning back." Cassie stumbled backward, her mind spinning. What door? What was this thing talking about? She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the suffocating grip of terror returning, wrapping itself around her like a vice. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on her, and the only thing that felt certain was the cold presence of the figure that now stood before her. "Who are you?" Cassie managed to whisper, her voice shaky and strained. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question. Then, without a word, it raised its hand again. This time, the temperature dropped so low that Cassie could see her breath in the air, thick and visible in the oppressive darkness. The shadows writhed, stretching and twisting as if they were alive, feeding on the fear that clung to the room. "It doesn't matter who I am," the figure said, its voice growing darker, more chilling. "What matters is that you've awakened something that cannot be undone." A low, guttural sound came from somewhere deep in the shadows, a noise that was neither human nor animal, but something far older, far more malevolent. The walls seemed to tremble with the sound, the air growing thick with the stench of decay and rot. Cassie's stomach lurched, and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her as the figure stepped closer, its face shifting and contorting in ways that defied the natural order. "You are its chosen now," the figure whispered, its eyes narrowing. "You belong to it, and it will never let you go." Cassie's heart raced as the reality of what was happening began to set in. The dark force that had haunted the campus wasn't just some prank. It wasn't just a simple ghost. It was something far older, far darker, and far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The figure raised its hand again, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward Cassie, their tendrils reaching out like fingers of the dead. In an instant, they wrapped around her, pulling her forward, dragging her toward the darkened corner of the room. She struggled, her body fighting against the invisible force that gripped her, but it was no use. She was powerless. "Please," Cassie gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, let me go." But the figure only smiled, a twisted, cruel grin that stretched impossibly wide across its face. "Once you've crossed the threshold," it said, "there is no return. There is only the darkness." With one final pull, the shadows dragged her forward, and Cassie was swallowed whole by the suffocating blackness. Cassie's world went dark. It was as though every part of her body had been submerged into a void, a place where nothing existed but an endless, suffocating silence. She could no longer feel the floor beneath her feet or the walls surrounding her. She couldn't even hear her own breath. It was as if her entire being had been swallowed whole, consumed by something that defied the laws of nature. Her mind raced. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of panic, confusion, and fear. The shadows had taken her, pulled her into their realm, and now she was lost in the abyss. She reached out with her hands, her fingers grasping at empty space, but there was nothing to hold on to. Nothing to anchor her. And yet, somewhere in the distance, she heard something, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as if it were getting closer. Cassie. The voice was haunting, a low, breathy sound that seemed to seep into her very soul. It was familiar, but at the same time, it was wrong, twisted in a way that made her skin crawl. Cassie. The voice was now closer, so close that it felt like it was inside her mind. She tried to scream, to fight back, but her voice failed her. No sound came out, only the overwhelming pressure of the darkness that pressed in on her from all sides. Please, no, she whispered to herself, her breath shaky. I don't want this. I just want to go home. But the voice wasn't listening. It was relentless, pushing its way into her thoughts, erasing everything else. Cassie, you can't leave. You're mine now. Forever. The words sent a cold wave of dread through her, her heart pounding against her rib cage. The voice wasn't just tormenting her. It was something worse, something that wasn't human, something ancient and malevolent. The whispers surrounded her, an endless chant that grew louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from all directions at once. She tried to block it out, tried to escape it, but there was no escaping the abyss. There was no escape from whatever this was. Suddenly, she felt something cold, something icy, grip her arm. It wasn't just the chill of the void, it was the touch of something that was not her own. Something foreign, something that shouldn't exist. Her body froze. The touch was gentle at first, like a soft caress, but then it tightened, pulling her toward a form that was taking shape in the darkness. It was like a shadow, formless at first, but slowly, it began to solidify, taking the shape of a figure. A figure that she knew. Cassie's breath caught in her throat as the figure became clearer, more defined. It was the same figure she had seen earlier in the party, the man with the hollow eyes and skeletal grin. But now, in the darkness, he was different. His form flickered like a flame, shifting and warping, his face a grotesque mask of malice. You thought you could escape, the figure said, his voice dripping with mockery. But you can't. You never could. The cold grip on her arm tightened, pulling her closer to him. His eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, locked onto hers, and for a moment, Cassie saw something in them. It wasn't just darkness. It was hunger. An insatiable, eternal hunger that had devoured everything in its path for centuries. Why? Cassie gasped, her voice breaking. Why are you doing this? The figure's grin widened, his teeth sharp and jagged like those of a wild animal. Because you're mine, he whispered. You belong to me now. And once you belong to me, there is no escape. The room around her began to shift, the darkness swirling like a storm, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Her body felt heavy, as though the very air was pressing down on her, crushing her. And then, just as the darkness began to consume her completely, a sudden, blinding light erupted from within her chest. Cassie screamed, her hands instinctively clutching at her chest as the light flared brighter and brighter, pushing against the darkness. The figure let out a terrible screech, his form flickering and distorting as though it were being torn apart by the light. For a moment, Cassie thought she might be free. The light was powerful, radiant, burning through the shadows that had held her captive. But even as she felt the darkness begin to retreat, the figure's voice echoed in her mind, cold and unyielding. You cannot destroy me. You can only delay the inevitable. The light flickered, and Cassie's heart sank. The darkness was too powerful, too vast. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't banish it. Not completely. And then, as if by some twisted fate, Cassie felt the ground beneath her feet once more. Her vision blurred, and the cold grip on her arm released. She gasped, her body suddenly feeling heavy, like she was waking from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The light faded, and she found herself back in the old dormitory. But it wasn't the same. The room was empty now. All of the students who had been frozen in place were gone, leaving only the remnants of the party, empty cups, broken decorations, and the smell of stale beer in the air. The walls still creaked, the floorboards still groaned, but there was something different. Something wrong. Cassie's legs wobbled beneath her as she stood, her mind spinning. Had it all been a hallucination? Had it really happened? Or was she still trapped in the darkness, lost in the nightmare? Then she heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Cassie. She froze. The voice was unmistakable. Cassie, I'm coming for you. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw it. The figure. The man with the hollow eyes. He was back. Cassie's heart stopped. The figure stood before her, his form now clearer than ever, his presence looming in the dim light of the abandoned dormitory. His eyes, those hollow, black pits, locked onto hers, and it was as if he were staring directly into her soul. His grin, sharp and unnatural, stretched wider, and for a brief moment, she saw the true extent of his twisted, monstrous nature. You can't run anymore, he whispered, his voice like cold, dry leaves scraping together in the wind. You've crossed the threshold. You belong to me. Cassie's body went cold. Her legs felt like lead, frozen in place, but somehow, she found the strength to speak. Why, she gasped, her voice trembling. Why me? The figure tilted his head, his lips curling into something that could have been a mockery of a smile. Because you were foolish enough to awaken what should have remained dormant. This place, this dormitory, is not just a building. It is a prison, a gateway, and now, you are the key. Cassie's mind raced. She remembered the strange whispers, the cold touch of the shadows that had dragged her into the abyss. She remembered the light that had briefly driven the darkness away. But it wasn't enough. It never was. You don't have to do this, Cassie said, her voice barely above a whisper, though every word felt like it was being torn from her. I won't let you take me. The figure's laugh echoed, hollow and unnerving, a sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the room. You think you have a choice? You're already mine. There's no escape from this. With that, the shadows around him began to twist, swirling in unnatural patterns, growing thicker, darker. The air around Cassie turned frigid, her breath coming out in sharp, visible gasps. The walls closed in, pressing down on her, but she refused to give in. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength within her. She had to fight back. She had to break free. In a desperate move, Cassie reached into the pocket of her jacket, her hand trembling as she pulled out the small, silver locket that had once belonged to her mother. She had almost forgotten about it, buried beneath her fear, but in that moment, the locket felt warm against her skin, like a beacon of hope. The figure paused, his grin faltering just slightly as he noticed the locket in her hand. "What do you think that will do?" he scoffed. Cassie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she pressed the locket to her chest, her fingers trembling but determined. She closed her eyes, blocking out the figure's menacing presence, focusing only on the warmth she felt radiating from the locket. It was the one thing she had left that felt real, that felt like a connection to something good. A soft hum began to fill the room, almost imperceptible at first, but then it grew louder, stronger. The shadows around her recoiled, as if repelled by the energy emanating from the locket. Cassie's heart pounded in her chest, the humming resonating through her very bones, and the darkness began to retreat, slowly, painfully, as if it were being torn apart. "No," the figure hissed, his voice rising in fury as the shadows around him began to unravel. "You can't do this. You don't understand." But Cassie didn't stop. She held onto the locket, clutching it with all her might, her eyes still shut tightly, her entire being focused on the light that was building inside her. The figure's form began to flicker, his features warping as the light from the locket grew brighter and brighter, pushing back the shadows that had consumed the room. His laughter turned into a scream of rage and terror, as the light consumed him, engulfing him in its blinding glow. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a final, deafening crack, the light exploded outward, and the figure vanished, his presence obliterated in an instant. The room was silent. Cassie stood there, her body trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows had receded, leaving the dormitory in a strange, eerie calm. The oppressive air had lifted, and the temperature had returned to normal. But even though the darkness had been banished, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air. She looked around the room. The other students, those who had been trapped in the nightmare with her, were now gone. The party was over. The building was empty. And yet, Cassie couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease that clung to her like a second skin. She stumbled toward the door, her legs weak beneath her. As her hand gripped the doorknob, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting the figure to reappear. But the room was empty. The air was still. For now, it was over. With a final, shaky breath, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The darkness may have been vanquished, but Cassie knew one thing for certain: she would never be the same again. And as she walked away from the haunted dormitory, a final whisper echoed in her mind. "You may have won tonight, but it's never truly over." The end, for now. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.